So please, everybody, return to your seats. We are starting. Our next speaker is Zhang from the University of Edinburgh. And the title of the talk is Responsiveness to Reasons and Changing One's Mind. Please, Jenny.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to thank Preston and the organising committee for having me at the conference, and it must be so much work putting everything together given the circumstances. So thanks so much for that. And I'll also just quickly apologise to people who have heard a version of this talk last week at the workshop. But yeah, hopefully for the rest of the audience, it's going to be somewhat refreshing and interesting. So I'm going to be talking about well, my title says that it's responsiveness to reasons and changing one's mind, but to be honest, I'm mainly focusing on talking about changing one's mind about the moral issue, and I'll do that through introducing a new player, which is narrative self-understanding. So the sort of questions that I'm interested in are, sorry, let me just quickly, yeah, there we go. The sort of questions that I'm interested in are things like what contributes to changing one's mind about a moral issue, what constitutes that sort of change of mind, and perhaps what is necessary and sufficient for changing one's mind about a moral issue. So I think that my proposal has some implications for how one responds to moral reasons in particular, but also reasons in general. And hopefully it points to some various players involved in such reasons responsiveness or sensitivity to reasons. So the plan is to first introduce a potential candidate to answer those questions, and that's from Hradec's social intuitionist model of moral judgment. And then I will say something about how I think that maybe we should look at a different account, and I'll be drawing on Mercier and Sperber's interactionist approach to reasoning. And then I will introduce my proposal, and that will incorporate meta evaluation via narrative understanding. And I'll try to apply my proposal by looking at what would make a morally dumbfounded person change her mind. And I'll briefly point to some potential problems and maybe my next steps. Okay, so let's start with Hradec's social intuitionist model of moral judgment. So Hradec's model is proposed as an alternative to the rationalist models of moral judgment, and it emphasizes two things. First of all, social and cultural influences play a significant role in shaping moral judgments, and second of all, moral intuitions as opposed to moral reasons usually directly resulting in moral judgments. So a couple of definitions here. Hradec defines moral judgment to be an evaluation of an individual's character or action made in respect of the virtues that a culture or subculture holds. And he thinks that moral reasoning is a conscious mental activity during which information about an individual is received, interpreted, evaluated, and modified to arrive at a moral judgment about the individual. So the process is conscious in the sense that it is intentional, affectful, and controllable, and the reasoner is aware of what's going on. And given that, Hradec thinks that moral reasons can be understood as the conscious thoughts, interpretations, explanations or evaluations that arise during moral reasoning in support of moral judgment. So Hradec defines moral intuition to be the sudden appearance in consciousness of a moral judgment without any conscious awareness of having gone through steps of searching, weighing evidence, or inferring a conclusion. So in that sense, moral intuitions are automatic gut feelings about a moral situation, which one suddenly becomes aware of without being aware of having undergone processes of seeking or weighing evidence or inferring a conclusion. Now, there are 6 links in Hradec's model which illustrate the interactions or relations between moral intuitions, judgments, and reasons. Hradec thinks that links 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the principal links of processes, while links 5 and 6 play a role only occasionally. So link 3 is going to be what I focus on for the purpose of my talk. So link 3 is the reasoned persuasion link between person A's moral reasons and person B's moral intuitions. Reasoned persuasion happens when A conveys the reasons for her moral judgments to B, and consequently some new moral intuitions are triggered in B. Importantly, when link 3 works between A and B, it is not because A's moral reasons serve as convincing arguments. Instead, it is because the process triggers in B somehow some moral intuitions. Now, one clarification is that Haidt does not deny that our immediate moral intuitions can be and are informed by conscious deliberation, but he doubts that changes in moral intuitions are often brought about via private reflection, which is link 6 in this case. So the key idea here is that one's moral judgment can be and is responsive to reasons or arguments that others present, but when that happens, it is ultimately a change in one's moral intuition that leads to the change in moral judgment. According to him, an individual changes her mind insofar as some new strong moral intuitions are triggered in her, and it is not because there are strong reasons or arguments offered against her existing moral judgment. Still, there might be some reason to think that one changes one's mind because there are strong arguments against one's judgment, especially in a social argumentative setting. I will now turn to Mercy and Sperber's account for a slightly different potential answer to questions concerning mind changing about a moral issue. So I probably won't go through this too much, but I would just like quickly highlight the bits that will be useful for me. So we all know that Mercy and Sperber's overarching thesis is that the distinctively human trait of reasoning has evolved and survived primarily for producing reasons to justify and producing arguments to convince others. Now, in What Good is Moral Reasoning, a paper Mercier wrote in 2011, he defends a view on moral reasoning that is somewhat intermediate between two extremes, one extreme being that reasoning efficiently corrects our intuitions, and the other extreme being that it barely ever does so. So he argues that in a social setting, reasoning should usually drive individuals to re-examine the moral judgments or decisions. That's to say that we have good reasons to think that when in the group, one does use reasoning to evaluate moral judgments and arguments, and is usually inclined to accept well-supported arguments. So to support this claim, several studies are cited that includes Jean Piaget's study on children, or versions of that study, James Fishkin's study on adults who debate about various policy matters, and Luskin and colleagues' studies. So the idea is that it seems that both adults and children, when put in groups, are responsive to convincing opposing arguments, and they do revise their initial judgments accordingly. Now, while I agree that strong opposing reasons or arguments play a bigger role than in changing one's mind than Haidt presumes, I believe that Mercy and Sperber's account does not adequately capture the means by which an argument gains its force in changing one's mind. So part of the motivation behind this is that a genuine change of mind is not just about changing the moral judgment in question, it also reflects a more enduring shift in one's moral intuitions, beliefs, and attitudes about some morally relevant issues. Perhaps it reflects a deeper, broader, and more persistent internalization of ideas, values, concepts, or norms. For instance, I think that a mere rehearsal or reproduction of a position and some supporting reasons for that position seems to neither constitute nor guarantee genuine mind changing. So I think one way to account for this larger, more persistent change is to regard the individual who undergoes a change of mind as a temporally extended living being with a distinctive understanding of herself, who has the ability and disposition to evaluate, assimilate, and make sense of her moral judgments and changing moral judgments with consideration of her narrative self-understanding. So here's what I propose. I think that when an individual encounters reasons or arguments that challenge her existing moral judgment, she might experience a new moral intuition. To undergo a change of mind, she needs to also meta-evaluate her initial judgment through evoking a distinctive understanding of herself, interpreting the new intuition on the basis of her past experiences, and anticipating future experience, given the new intuition and existing narrative self-understanding. So a few words on what meta-evaluation and narrative self-understanding are in my picture. I take meta-evaluation of a judgment to be the process during which higher order appraisals, judgments, preferences, etc. about a judgment are produced. And I have in mind a rather permissive sort of like notion of meta-evaluation. An evaluative process is a meta-evaluative one insofar as its product has in its content another evaluation. That evaluation could be a moral judgment, it could be about an object, a person, the person's character, an action, a state of affair, etc. So for instance, if I make the first order judgment, eating brownies is good, and I make a second order judgment, I might be wrong that eating brownies is good, the latter is a product of meta-evaluation. So I also think that one does not have to be aware of the entire meta-evaluative process for it to count as a meta-evaluation. For instance, that could be inferential mechanisms that one is unaware of, which produce an appraisal about a first order judgment that one has made. And given this, meta-evaluating one's moral judgment through appealing to one's narrative self-understanding is assessing whether or why one's moral judgment is true through appealing to one's narrative self-understanding. So the sort of narrative self-understanding that I have in mind is adapted from Valeman. Broadly speaking, Valeman is interested in what constitutes practical reasoning, rationality, agency, and selfhood. According to him, narrative understanding contributes to practical rationality when one's past narrations influence and cohere with one's present and future in a sensible way. So narrative understanding serves as a tool, both for one to make sense of one's behavior and for one to direct future behavior in a way that makes sense. So Valeman takes narrative to be an account of a series of causally connected events, which has a beginning, middle, and an end understood in terms of their emotional structure. The beginning triggers an emotional response in the audience, the middle advances or complicates the emotional reaction, and the end concludes or resolves it. A narrative describes some causally connected events in a way that makes its audience experience a flow of emotions about them. And Valeman calls this mentioned flow of emotions emotional cadence. Importantly, experiencing an emotional cadence that corresponds to narrated events constitutes a distinctive way of understanding the event, and that is what characterizes narrative. And this distinctive understanding of narrated events is narrative understanding. So just to illustrate a little bit more what Valeman means by emotional cadence, so here's what he says about the conclusory emotion at the end of the emotional cadence. He says that the emotion that resolves a narrative cadence tends to subsume the emotions that preceded it. The triumph felt at a happy ending is the triumph of ambitions realized and anxieties allayed. The grief felt at a tragic ending is the grief of hopes dashed or loves denied. Hence, the conclusory emotion in a narrative cadence embodies not just how the audience feels about the ending, it embodies how the audience feels at the ending about the whole story. And that's the sort of like emotional structure or implicit emotional linkages that I will be drawing on in developing my notion of narrative self-understanding. So before I go there, I think one attractive feature of Valeman's view is that it focuses on using narrative as a sense-making device, and it takes narrative understanding to be grounded in emotional experiences. So this means that an individual does not have to actively narrate or identify herself as a character in a very unified life story in order to qualify as having some narrative self-understanding. So insofar as one is a living being who persists through time, having experiencing, about to experience certain emotions as associated with some causally connected event, one is able to acquire an understanding of such events in terms of the emotional cadence involved, and that constitutes narrative understanding. So in the context of my current discussion, this implies that a moral judgment maker or interpreter, just in virtue of being a temporally expanded living person, capable of experiencing emotions in correspondence to a life event, is able to and does possess some narrative self-understanding. The way she feels about a current event, state of affairs, situation, or judgment follows from her prior affective experiences and influences her future experiences. So accordingly, I take narrative self-understanding to be a distinctive understanding that one has of one's behavior, judgments, beliefs, attitudes, preferences, values, etc., which is constituted by the emotional structure or linkages that one experiences as a temporally expanded living being. And to say that one engages in meta-evaluation of a judgment through appealing to narrative self-understanding is to say that one forms higher order appraisals, judgments, preferences, etc. about a judgment through evoking this distinctive narrative understanding of oneself, which is in terms of the emotional structure or linkages that one experiences. So what is the role of strong opposing reasons or arguments in my picture then? I think that they contribute to mind changing through A, helping to elicit the new strong intuition necessary for changing one's mind, and corresponding to influencing or becoming part of one's narrative self-understanding. However, as the production of a new strong intuition could be achieved by other means, such as experiencing a significant life event, I think strong opposing reasons or arguments are not necessary for the acquisition of such an intuition. Meanwhile, strong reasons could hook onto features of one's narrative self-understanding. So strong reasons or arguments could stick in a way, precisely because of the sort of narrative self-understanding that one has. As such, it might be too quick to assume that a strong argument exerts more or less the same force on different individuals, for its effectiveness is partly determined by an individual's particular narrative self-understanding. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the phenomenon of moral dumbfounding now, so that I could try to apply my proposal to a particular case. Now, moral dumbfounding is dubbed by Hradec and colleagues to refer to the phenomenon where individuals exhibit stubborn and puzzled maintenance of judgment without supporting reasons, or where they are startled at the inability to offer reasons for some moral judgments that they hold, but insist on the judgments anyway. So in the study by Hradec and colleagues, participants were presented with 5 tasks in which they were asked to make a judgment or perform an action. And then the experimenter will question their judgment or actions or play the devil's advocate by questioning their reasons. So one of the tasks involved presenting the participants with the following incest scenario. So the idea is that Julie and Mark are brother and sister, and they decide to engage in consensual incestuous sex. And the scenario is construed in such a way that there are no immediate either physical or emotional harm done to either party, and the participants were asked, oh, is it okay for them to make love? So here's what Hradec and colleagues report as their findings. They say that participants were often clearly dumbfounded by the moral intuition stories, such as the incest story, and they claim to have found some markers of dumbfounding. The most salient is that people who are dumbfounded will tell you so. They would say things like, I know it's wrong, but I just can't come up with a reason why. And they also report to be more confused or to be relying more on gut than reasons. So I think that while certain parameters of the experiment could be questioned, and there's probably an array of plausible explanations for why the participants could not articulate good supporting reasons for their judgments under those conditions, I want to take on board the observation that individuals sometimes make certain moral judgments, struggle to offer supporting reasons for them, but insist on them anyway. And that's the sort of observation that I would take on board. So my question is, what would make these morally dumbfounded individuals change their mind? And I'm going to be talking about a morally dumbfounded person's PMD hereafter. So if Hradec is right, PMD would change her mind insofar as some new strong moral intuitions are triggered in her. It could be that after hearing the experimenter's arguments against her initial judgment, PMD acquires a new strong intuition. Something like this incest case is not wrong, that overrides her initial judgment. According to Mercier and Sperber, the strength of the arguments or reasons should make a difference. So if they are strong and convincing, PMD is more likely to revise her initial judgment and change her mind. So addressing the question why individuals like PMD do not change their minds, Mercier and Sperber in their book actually suggest that in some cases, individuals could have some other concerns giving rise to, for instance, a strong intuitive reluctance to accept a given conclusion. However, they think that most moral beliefs are more amenable to arguments than, say, gut feelings about incest. So in my account, PMD would change her mind if she acquires a new strong intuition and she meta-evaluates her initial moral judgment and assimilates the new intuition through appealing to her narrative self-understanding. So here's an illustration. PMD might have always felt a sense of disgust or aversion towards incest. Perhaps she has some siblings and the thought of having consensual sex with one of her siblings is repulsive and almost unimaginable to her. Perhaps some of her prior experiences were such that whenever the topic of incest was brought up, other members in her community expressed disgust or disapproval. Examples of those occasions were when her companion expressed an aversive attitude to a fictional story that involved incest, or when the public condemned a perpetrator of child abuse in the media. She shared similar sentiments on those occasions. Given those emotional experiences, she genuinely feels and thinks that she is someone who does not condone incest. She then makes sense of her current response to the incest scenario presented to her through the lens of her past. Since her prior emotional experiences have led her to feel and think that she does not condone incest, she could engage in meta-evaluation and form the judgment that her present judgment, this incest case, is wrong, as well as the feelings of aversion or disgust that accompany it constitute a response that follows from and fits well with what precedes it. So when presented with strong opposing reasons or counter-arguments, PMD might acquire a new strong intuition, which is something like, oh, this incest case is not wrong. Now, the reasons or counter-arguments might have aligned well with or spoken to some features of PMD's narrative self-understanding. For instance, she might have seen herself as a libertarian who, for instance, has upheld the value of freedom and internalized some harm-based principles. In the past, she might have experienced feelings of disapproval, indignation, anger, or sadness when someone's freedom was compromised or when someone was harmed, and an absence of those feelings in situations when no one was harmed and where one's freedom was respected. Perhaps she also had some prior experiences reading literature, watching films, or engaging in conversations that allowed her to feel differently about some incestuous cases. For example, she could have read some books by John Irving, which depict complex, full-life characters who at times find themselves in incestuous situations. She could have connected with those characters or empathized with their experiences and thus understood their choices and behavior. She might also have had some prior experiences where she revised her judgments or beliefs for a variety of reasons, and she generally takes pride in being someone who is open to opposing viewpoints or alternative suggestions. So she could have felt like enlightened when presented with some considerations of which she was previously unaware. She might have felt proud of being able to grasp the complexity of various issues and arrive at different conclusions on certain occasions. So in this case, PMD could assess and assimilate her newly acquired intuition about the incest case in light of those past experiences. Since her prior emotional experiences make her feel and think that she is a libertarian who is also empathetic, open-minded, and undogmatic, she makes the assessment, belief, or judgment that her new intuition, which is that this incest case is not wrong, as well as the feelings or emotions that accompany it, such as a sense of empathy, acceptance, or enlightenment, they constitute a response that follows from and fits well with what precedes it. So with this new intuition fitted into her larger narrative self-understanding, PMD will be able to use her running self-narrative to direct the future. She had some emotional experiences that were associated with being a libertarian, being empathetic towards some about fictional incestuous scenarios, being receptive to alternative perspectives, and sometimes changing her mind as a result. And she's currently undergoing a similar emotional experience following the acquisition of the new intuition, right? So this allows her to see herself as someone who could accept incest on some occasions, maybe. She could then form an intention to, for example, be more sensitive to the specific contexts of different incestuous cases. Forming an intention to do or not do something comprises a forward-looking feature. So it is about making plans for the future and anticipating new experiences. And in this case, it is about directing and constraining future experiences that are to do with incest. Okay, so that's the application of my case. And the following bit will be like, somewhat sketchy because this is the bit that I'm trying to work out. I will briefly point to some problems and primarily one challenge to my account. So some might ask, why do arguments need to produce some new intuitions to contribute to mind changing? It seems possible to change one's mind to a new position in response to an argument, even if one finds the position itself counterintuitive. So in other words, it seems possible to be convinced by an argument and adopt the position that the argument supports without experiencing the intuitive pull of the position. For instance, PMD could find convincing the argument for why the given incest scenario is not wrong, and thus adopt a position that this incest case is not wrong, without feeling that the incest case is not wrong. So I think that there's something psychologically strange, if not psychologically impossible, about the case just outlined. So for one thing, if PMD truly finds the opposing argument convincing, she must feel at least some degree of sympathy towards the position that the argument supports. It could be that she does not feel very strongly about the position, but it would be odd if she experiences no degree of sympathy at all towards the position. So I take feeling some degree of sympathy towards the position to be experiencing an intuition in favor of the position. Now, I suspect that part of the underlying issue here is that there are different senses of mind changing. So on one hand, changing one's mind seems to center around understanding opposing arguments or reasons, as understanding is often demonstrated through articulating reasons or one's thought process. And articulation of supporting arguments or reasons for a position points to an understanding of the position. And if initially one does not hold the position in question, demonstrating an understanding of the position could indicate that one has changed one's mind. On the other hand, mind changing seems to demand some feel it in your bones phenomenology in addition to understanding certain arguments or reasons. And the latter is what propels me towards my proposal. However, if there are indeed different senses of mind changing, the necessary claim of my central thesis will be challenged. Perhaps what I have shown so far is that in some cases of mind changing, one needs to have a new strong intuition and to assimilate the intuition through appealing to one's narrative self-understanding. And I have not yet shown that that has to be the case for all instances of mind changing, especially the cases of the understanding sense of mind changing. I'm also trying to work out the exact relationship between intuition and narrative self-understanding. So I think it might turn out to be a little misleading to spell out my thesis this way, putting intuition and meta-evaluation via narrative self-understanding into two separate conditions, as I suspect that they share a more intimate relationship. So one idea that seems very plausible to me at this point is that the very reason why some arguments or reasons could give rise to a strong intuition is that they could hook on to some features of one's narrative self-understanding. And I think there might also be some concern about whether the incest case serves as a paradigmatic case. So like what Mercy and Sperber point out, which I completely agree, incest is a somewhat special case. And I think people have strong feelings against it. It could be due to sort of like taboo surrounding it. One could even argue for some evolutionary advantage of being averse to incest. So there might be some sort of like evolutionarily hardwired thing going on. The larger point is, I think for my story to work, I might need to illustrate that it applies to and is indeed a better account for various cases of mind changing, including more ordinary and moral cases. So here are just like, some thoughts that I have and some potential objections and future directions that I can take on. So this is very much a work in progress. Any feedback, questions or comments will be more than welcome. And I think I might have spoken a little bit too far. So that's me. Thank you.
You? Okay. So, questions? Yes.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks so much. This was super interesting. So I have this worry about that makes me think that I'm just missing something about the project. Because one thought I had is, well, there's a lot of different ways you could change your mind, right? You could be brainwashed, you could have an argument, you could have an emotional response that fits into your self-narrative. All those are ways that you could change your mind. And this is sort of one of those things that it's hard to do from the armchair, but rather like if we just wanted to learn about how people tend to change their minds on moral matters, we would have to do some studies and like look at the causes. And then I wondered, well, maybe I'm missing something because there's something maybe special about moral knowledge or moral belief that in order to truly believe a moral proposition or truly know moral proposition, it requires the phenomenological stuff you're talking about, the feeling it in your bones. And I was just wondering, are you committed to some view about moral belief or moral knowledge being special in that way, that would explain why it's okay to do this a little bit from the armchair more than rather just from studying how people come to change their minds about things.
Thanks. So I would say that I do think that there's something quite special about the moral case, but at the same time, I feel like this sort of proposal that I have just sketched could apply to non-moral cases as well. And I don't think that this is just me sitting in the armchair, kind of like, philosophizing about how people change their mind. I think the notion of narrative self-understanding is quite a useful one to think about why certain arguments or reasons stick with people. Why is it that people respond to certain arguments or reasons under certain conditions better than others? So like on the one hand, I do think that the moral case is somewhat special, and I think it's partly because when it comes to moral arguments, reasons, moral judgments, they are so intertwined with, well, in a lot of cases, they are very intertwined with the sort of like values and norms and cultural commitments that you have. So that's quite different from, let's say, changing your mind about, I don't know, like a mathematical logical puzzle, for example. But I also do think that at the same time, like certain non-moral cases work quite similarly to the sort of moral cases that I've been talking about. And I think that the same sort of proposal should apply to those non-moral cases as well.
Wolf?
Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I was wondering, so I have some problems with the Haidt dumbfounding literature for several reasons, and I was wondering how much of that affects your view. So my reasons for having problems with that is, first, that I think the empirical basis is actually much weaker than what's sometimes claimed. If you dig up the thing, some of this, like the crucial paper hasn't been published, and I think there's a reason why he didn't publish it. So, there I have some empirical uneasiness about that, but also theoretically, I'm thinking, the way he set it up, he then asked people, why do you think it's wrong that they had sex, right? And why? And he constantly was insinuating the people who did the experiments was insinuating that they had to give some kind of instrumental reason. And I'm thinking, if you asked me, and insofar as I'm against incest, I would say, why was it wrong that they had sex? Because they are brother and sister. The reasons end there. Sometimes reasons come to an end. That is a good place for reasons to come to an end. I did give reasons. I'm perfectly justified. I'm justified by reasons. This is not an intuition. This is not a feeling. And that this is a reason, that's a brute fact. That some things are reasons for other things. This also comes to an end at some point. And maybe I can give a further justification. Maybe I can't, but that's a meta consideration, like in many other fields as well. So there, I'm thinking, if you think about it this way, then the division that Haidt makes between intuition and feeling and reason comes under pressure. And I'm wondering how much of that applies to your view, because you also want to have this, you talk about intuition and then about this self-interpretive narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with you. And I think that's the problem that I have with Haidt studies and the whole moral dumbfounding literature. And so I think one thing is that I do think that the sort of case that I've been drawing on, which is the moral dumbfounding case, might not be the best case to use as a paradigmatic case, like I mentioned at the end of the presentation. So that's one thing. Another thing is I'm also not that committed to the entire Haidt picture. So I think I'm primarily using that to kind of tease out one way of thinking about mind changing in the moral domain. But I am not that committed to Haidt's understanding of intuition, which is something that I should have clarified. I think I'm going more with Mercy and Sperber's idea of intuition. I don't think it's a sort of completely useless concept to talk about intuition. But I also don't think Haidt's characterization of it makes much sense in terms of talking about moral judgments and changing one's mind about a moral position or about a moral issue. But yeah, so like I said, I totally agree with you, and I don't think that I am or I intend to rely that much on Haidt's model in general, and definitely not on his moral dumbfounding cases. And hopefully, so this is where I'm trying to go next is to kind of apply the case or my proposal to non-moral dumbfounding cases, other moral cases, and to kind of like test it out to see whether it works. Maybe that would kind of avoid the problem.
Okay, any more questions, comments, anything? Preston?
So, hi, Jenny. I want to ask, so at the end of your talk, you came around to saying that we've got maybe sufficient conditions, but not necessary ones. And then there's a question of whether we can go on. But I was wondering, even in the cases where it's supposed to be sufficient, what explanatory role is the narrative self-understanding supposed to play? Because as I took it, in the middle of your talk, it looked like you were saying that this sort of narrative self-understanding doesn't have to be the kind of thing where you've got an integrated story about your life. It can be thinner than that. And then I'm wondering, what explanatory role is it playing? Because insofar as the intuition is involved, why isn't that just sufficient as an explanation? I mean, sure, maybe sometimes there's narrative self-understanding, but sometimes also it's Tuesday. And that doesn't mean that the intuition plus it's Tuesday is playing an explanatory role. So could you say a little something about maybe even just characterizing the difference between having a shift in intuition and not having a narrative self-understanding, and the case where you've got both, and why the one is better as an explanation than the other?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. So I suppose like part of the motivation is to think about someone as persisting through time, as a temporally extended living being. So one way to think about the difference between just having a new intuition and like having the intuition bit, like plus the narrative self-understanding bit, is that I think an intuition could be quite short-lived. So like I'm thinking about like, you know, say like when you're engaging in a conversation and someone has convinced you to switch to a different position. I feel like there were instances of those like conversations, like in my personal experience, where I felt like at that point, I felt like, oh, I'm quite convinced by this argument. And then I just don't quite do anything about that. So like, you know, it doesn't show up like in my behavior. It doesn't like, you know, reflect anything like in my future sort of like planning. It doesn't construe in a way how I behave in future. So like, I think that's like, you know, in some cases for a mere new intuition does. And in the case of like having that intuition and narrative self-understanding, using narrative self-understanding to assimilate that intuition, I think that's a more like broader, sustained kind of like change in the way you behave, in the way you think about stuff, in the way you engage with the world, like in future. So I think that that's kind of like the key difference I take to be between the two cases. And I also think that there's some value in just thinking about someone as having a sort of like, you know, like I said, like the sort of narrative self-understanding could be like thinner than like having a very verbalized autobiographical kind of like narration of one's life. I think there's some value in terms of like introducing that sort of like emotional linkages and structures as something that position oneself in relation to position like to issues or judgments and behavior and to other people, right? So I do think that a lot of things that we do are reflective of some of the prior emotional experiences that we have, and it does not have to reflect in terms of, it does not have to be reflected in the sort of like articulations of like reasons and thoughts that we have, but it just somehow shows up in the way we behave and the way we construe certain scenarios and the way we engage with the things around us. So I think that's another value of like introducing the sort of like loose or like thin sense of like narrative self-understanding that I'm talking about. Maybe part of the broader project is to introduce that sort of like the value of that sort of like effective emotional experiences in reasoning, right? I really don't think they are like, you know, that dichotomous, and I do think that they share a more intimate and entangled role. So the broader project might be, you know, just to introduce the sort of like role or like value of effective emotional experiences in general.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, we still have a time for a question if there's one. If there's none, then let's thank our speaker once more. And
thank you very much for the questions. Yeah.
And let me remind you that that's it for today, because we heard the talk of Petrosaris already in the morning. So Preston wants to say something? No. Okay.